Without further ado, I'll leave the floor to Jorgelina de Rosario, sorry. Bloomberg, yes, Bloomberg, who will moderate the session. Thank you so much for doing it, Jorgelina. The floor is yours.
I'm a little bit shorter. Thank you. Hi, my name is Jorgelina. Thank you so much all for joining this session, those who are here in the room and those who are following us online. We are going to discuss Argentina, discussion of Argentina's debt history and current events from the 2000 default to Javier Milei. So hopefully we will have some fun, right? We have here with us Gregory Makoff, Senior Fellow at Center for International Governance Innovation and the author of Default, the landmark court battle over Argentina's 1,000 billion debt restructuring. Anahí Wiedenbrüg, researcher at Latin American University of Social Science, and Juan Carluccio, economic advisor at Banque and professor of economics at the University of Surrey. Thank you so much all for coming. It's a pleasure to be here. I have covered sovereign debt kind of by chance. Back in 2012, an editor came to Infobae. I was working there in Argentina, and basically gave me a court ruling, said, you write and you speak in English, so you can push a story out, right? So I said, okay, yes, this sounds easy, right? It wasn't. I started reading this court ruling, and Greg talks a lot about those court rulings in his book. Start reading holdout, readable payment, pari passu, and I did not understand anything about it. It was my first time covering sovereign debt, the first time reading a court ruling in English. But I don't know, I was hooked and have been since, and I have been covering sovereign debt since then. I even remember when I was reading Greg's book that someone gave me Judge Giersey's home number. I call him, I say, why not? I call him, introduce myself, said, I'm Jorgelina, I'm covering in Argentina, I'm covering this debt saga, I would like to speak to you. And the only thing I've heard on the other side of the line was, oh, no, thank you. Oh, no, bye-bye, thank you. That was the shortest phone conversation I have ever had in my life. So if anybody wants to beat that, I'm up for the challenge. But that's, the perfect mix, I think, of debt and drama that brought us here. And that is why this case and this country and these debt issues interest us so much. I think that we're going to discuss not only Greg's book, but also what brought Argentina to this era. And we can take the book as a guideline, but also as a tool to understand the present and what's going on today with Javier Milei administration. Because as we know, these, of course, are decisions that are, considered and taken care of by persons, people calling the shots, making the big decisions that can basically change the course of a country. And we're going to kick off with a presentation from each of the panelists, and we'll start with Greg, then Anahí, and then Juan. Thank you so much for coming, but please remember that we want you all to participate. We want you to be engaged in the conversation, so please have your questions ready, because we're going to open up to the panel to have a key and active participation in this panel. Thank you so much.
Okay. Oh, if you want to put it on. I was a little bit disturbed with the prior panel because I planned to say I had hoped to make it interesting, to make this a provocative discussion. Given that word was used at least 10 times in the prior panel, I had to find some synonyms. So challenging, disturbing, exciting, inspirational, insulting, offensive, outrageous. I will try my best. So there's no time in a 5-minute remarks to go through the whole history of the book, but I'm happy to be here talking with Jorgelina and Anahí and Juan. It's hard enough to write about the past, and this particular situation with Milei is just unbelievable and unfolding by the day, and so worth a lot of speculation. The story itself told in the book, this beautiful book, available online, is pretty complicated. And it goes through what is really the worst debt restructuring in history, the messiest, longest, hard fought. And Giannis isn't here, but he said, why don't countries have their own debt sustainability analysis? Well, Argentina tried that, and their conclusion was that creditors only get 25 cents on the dollar. And creditors didn't like that, and that didn't turn out very well. So that's a lesson in trying to change the rules. Doesn't always work out as you expected. After the deal was done, there were a lot of holdouts, and there was a decade of litigation involving lots of attachment efforts all over the world. So there's a couple chapters explaining how attachment really works. It's actually very hard. And that led to a lot of frustration with the famous Judge Grisey with his equal treatment rulings that nobody understood at the time, except Elliot. And then there was that ruling, and then Argentina defaulted again. And then out of the blue, the Macri team of Caputo and Basili turned the tables on the hedge funds and got a great deal for Argentina. So it's quite a dramatic story. But since we're at a theoretical conference, how does the world work? How can we make it work better? The reality is it's a study in not the law of debt and not the economics of debt, but about the bargaining. And throughout the story, there's just a fight going on, which is who controls the outcome of the debt restructuring. And it was very explicit in this case. Argentina had the lost decade of the 80s. And I feel for the people of Argentina in the 80s, in the 90s, in 2000, and today. And the government said, with the misery of the Great Depression in Argentina of 2001, 2002, we never want to be here again. We need a deep haircut. This is how much we can pay. But the creditors said, well, wait a minute, I lent you the money, and no deal is valid unless I bless it. And my committee says it's not valid unless we get 75% of our money back, not 25%. And then the IMF has an odd role here. Would typically, under the SDRM, which it had proposed in this time period, would have been the masters of ceremony, but it worked out differently. In reality, this is a cooperative undertaking. At the table, the country, the creditors, and the IMF, and behind the IMF, the G7, the G20. Instead, all three legs of the triangle broke down. Everybody was fighting, and it ended up in court. But it's all about leverage, all about power struggles. The economics in the law are used to create leverage to get what you want. And that's what it's a study of. Now, I don't have this analogy right, because I haven't used it before, but if you have a civilization that lives in a big valley, and it has factories, and the factories create smog, and in this case, the smog is the debt. You can say, well, we're being choked by this debt. Let's bash a hole in the mountain to let all the choking debt out, which is the debt restructuring. But the problem is, you kind of got to shut down the factory too to stop creating the debt. And what happens as a background story in my book about the negotiations and the economics and the law and the fighting in court is Argentina starts overspending again. And by the time it has fixed the debt after 15 years, it is falling back into crisis. The crisis it is still in today, which is sad. And this particular graph is valuable because the first part on the left is Argentina's program in the 90s, the program supported by the IMF. The country in a decade did not create a positive primary surplus. It was pretty good to be flat, considering the US is going, what, minus 6% or something in all the countries around the world now. But inheriting the Brady stock of debt from the crisis of the 80s, the old debt kept growing and growing. And so the country needed to be generating some debt reduction during the decade. Instead, it grew and it blew up. For a few years under Nestor Kirchner and Roberto Lavagna, and after the real devaluation of 2002, the country ran gigantic primary surpluses of the order of 5%, the same level Milei is targeting now, and it stabilized the economy. But once, as Natalie or Janos was saying on the prior panel, once we got to 2% growth, then we kicked out the reformers. And so once they got the economy going again, Kirchner let Lavagna out, and Lavagna was the one controlling the spending, and all those primary surpluses went down and down and down to sharply negative. And what happened was crisis returned. You can see around 16, 17, Macri tried to close the gaps, but he did it too slowly, and he relied on a lot of foreign funding and got blown up in the process. So that was a failed effort. He left in crisis. So where are we today? Historically, during this story, the hedge funds, those buitros, are the national enemies, like Trump and the wall and Trump and China. It's blame the lenders, blame the vultures. And economically, it's more debt restructuring and less belt tightening. And Macri, while I'm finishing the book, just pops out of nowhere. Who's heard of this guy? And he says contracts should be honored. And he explains fiscal deficits lead to money printing, leads to inflation, which is kind of true. And so is this history going to change? Is it going to go back to the early 2000s? But this depends on rewriting a social contract. So I see where he came from. He came from the decades of crisis. As a historian, I see him as a product of it. What happens tomorrow? Is his plan good or bad? Will he succeed? That's why we invited help. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. How do I get notes?
Yes, yeah.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, perfect. Yeah. Perfect. Well, thank you very much for inviting me, Greg, for the opportunity of commenting on your book. It is as impossible to comment on the whole book as it is to summarize it in 5 minutes. But I'll start with what Greg himself in his conclusions calls the main lesson of the story. So obviously, this is not exhaustive, as I said, but one of the main lessons that Greg draws is that the United States and the International Monetary Fund need to be more involved in international financial crisis resolution. And the IMF specifically needs to be involved in restructurings with private bondholders to a greater extent. So I'd like to first unpack this a little bit and then talk about how I kind of see this main lesson also in Argentina's more recent history. So where's this coming from? I think the historical kind of point of comparison are the 80s, the era of syndicated loans, where the United States very much had a strategic interest to get its hands dirty. I think there's a kind of very nice quote in Greg's book, which is full of very nice quotes, which is from former Federal Reserve Governor Paul Volcker, who is asked by the International New York Times, are you really kind of fit to take on this new job in Wall Street? And then he says, I don't know who you thought was making all those deals. I was. So clearly you have a United States which is heavily involved in restructuring with private bondholders. Fast forward to the beginning of the 2000s, after Anne Kruger unsuccessfully tried to push for a sovereign debt restructuring mechanism at IMF, you have a very different story. So you have one where John Taylor, the Undersecretary of International Affairs, says, well, the US is not going to get involved. And you have the managing director of the IMF
essentially stating the same, following a party line. This is the hands-off approach that kind of stands in contrast to the syndicated loans and kind of 1980s era. How much of a hands-off approach is it in practice? Well, Greg, and I want to be as fair as possible to you here, kind of questions it very quickly. So there's a very kind of neat moment in the book where he talks about the 2003 standby agreement of Argentina with the IMF. And there's one kind of particular element that he picks up on, which is the lending into arrears policy of the IMF and the good faith component therein. So essentially what happens is that first, bondholders lobby the IMF in the 90s to change the lending into arrears policy, saying that the good faith component should not only entail consulting with countries, but actually negotiating, not only consulting with bondholders, but negotiating with them. They succeed in that kind of battle. The lending into arrears policy is changed, and then they move on to arguing, lobbying executive directors at the IMF board to try to get them to agree with their claim that Argentina is not negotiating in good faith, according to that definition, and that hence the review should not be approved, and it should actually put off the IMF's executive board's agenda. What does all of this show? At least in my mind, it shows two things. First, that, and this is, in Argentina, we have a saying that is chocolate por la noticia, like chocolate for the news. It's a very obvious claim to make. The IMF is a highly political institution. It is political first because you have a kind of discrepancy between what policy and staff say and what the executive directors of its biggest members often push for. And it is also a political institution in the sense that they are an object for sometimes successful lobbying of outsiders, sometimes private creditors. The second thing which it reveals is that the hands-off approach is at best an illusion, and that the IMF is very much involved in private debt restructurings currently as well. It is an informal referee of the system, and we see this as much in Zambia as we saw it in Argentina. So now to kind of get to the present, and I'll do this very quickly because I've been told by Jorgelina that she's going to be strict on time. Basically, Greg's book ends in 2016. 2 years later, we have the standby agreement signed by Macri, $57 billion US, of which 45 were discharged. This is a IMF program which, to put it in the most politically correct form possible, very much stretched the IMF's exceptional access criteria. So out of the 4, I think 3 are difficult to justify ex post facto that they were actually met. And so I think that is just an illustration of, in a way, the political character of the IMF. But maybe to kind of end with a more positive story, in the debt restructuring of 2019 to 2020, the IMF actually was able to play a different role. Why was this so? Well, because the Argentine government took the decision of starting with the negotiation with private bondholders, reversing the kind of more traditional order of first, starting with the renegotiation of the standby agreement that was derailed and stopped at the time. And they asked the IMF to do a DSA outside of an ongoing IMF program and Article 4 consultations. That enabled the IMF to conduct its DSA, which was very helpful in restructurings with bondholders. And in a way, it kind of was very much country-driven. So we're talking in the session before about the importance of ownership. I think this is a very good example of the country sitting at the driver's seat of the negotiation and asking the IMF to do something that was actually helpful for the negotiations. So my alternative lesson is we don't necessarily need more United States. We don't necessarily need more IMF. From the perspective of the debtor country, we do need to acknowledge the institution as it is, the IMF as it is, highly political. We do not need to fight it. We just need to know how to deal with an institution such as that. And we need the fund to do its job well, be it kind of actually staying to a policy that they write, or, like in my mind, also moving from pro-growth fiscal adjustment to growth to the core. And then secondly, we need the debtor to kind of sit at the driver's seat of the negotiation at all times. So more debtor, maybe less United States and IMF would be the punchline. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Anahí. Juan, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much. So thank you very much for the invitation to be here. And this is very pleasure to have discussed this book. So let me start also by praising Greg's work that brought us together, even if we are talking more about our country. But, it's really, you read the book, I really much enjoyed it. This guy is completely crazy, like spending it until 4 or 5 a.m., maybe looking 800 pages hearings, and try to have a sort of comprehensive story on something that, has many layers to it: economic, politics, the IMF, the domestic law, how that, collides with foreign law, because, we have to issue debt in another country with another different type of law and ways of doing things, and you arrive to explain complicated legal concepts for dummies like myself. I come from a lawyer family, and this is, I think, why I decided to study economics in a way, right? So because but one very interesting thing in the book is that you highlight from the beginning. You highlight really from the beginning the role of details, right? Key individuals, right? The details of how I read two words, pari passu, how ideologies, state of mind, belief of people can really turn around the events. And for us, economists, we are the contrary of that. We want to abstract from things. So I like that was a very interesting thing. So there are many interesting reflections. I cannot go into all of them because the idea today is more, at least to me, to talk more about our economy. One thing that really struck me was this issue of, what is the boundary of government? What is government, right? So is the central bank an alter ego of the government? Well, that's a huge discussion in our country. But then someone else comes, okay, if it's an alter ego, now I give the money of the central bank, right? And if you heard the news today, that was the same with our state-owned, the oil company, YPF. People are saying, it's the same thing as the national government, so I cannot touch those things. So it's very interesting in the book how these sort of domestic discussions, collide with, external reality. So, and it's also like a road trip on Argentina economics and politics. Now, it's very difficult to talk about Argentina because, everything that happens to me has a lot to do with what has been passing in the past. If you want to understand one crisis, you go to the and so on. But, the 2001 crisis is it's the starting point of the book, but I think it's a good starting point here. I'm going to say why. So if you allow me like a couple of things about, to give context for those we are not familiar to this. So we had the currency board in the 90s, right? So we fixed the exchange rate 1-to-1. And it's a moment, at least for nominal values, very good. Like, we had like single-digit inflation. It was the first time in my life that I've seen that, right? I think we're going well. The person was living in Argentina, a little personal thing. So, I was working for the government. I was getting my salary in a peso account in a state-owned bank. You're still forced to do that, right? But I had another account in dollars. So at the beginning of the month, say, okay, I'm going to save this part. So I will immediately convert everything to dollars. I mean, that would not probably make sense. But we were all doing that. But if you don't have inflation, if the exchange rate is fixed, it's not really an incentive to that, right? But in the end, it really amounts to trust. Money, by the very nature, is your trust. You cannot back all the monetary aggregates with dollars, right? That was kind of the idea. So, maybe politicians, we knew we have to change that system. There were discussions in the government at that time. Make story short, it was the market or the economic forces that, took us out. So we passed with a huge devaluation from 1 to 4 on the dollar, the stabilization at 3. The debt was defaulted. It was a very difficult time for us politically, socially. Even now, I'm thinking about that, I'm kind of shaking. There were people dying in the street. I mean, I was just working in front of the Plaza de Mayo where everything was happening, right? And we have 5 presidents in 1 week. The president left in a helicopter. One of these 5 declared the default, and 3 days later, he went to the provinces and resigned. So it was a very, very difficult time for us. And of course, the economic consequences were devastating. Huge recession, poverty. 2/3 of people reached poverty. Was very, and because they were in dollars, right? All these dollar deposits, they were forcibly converted into pesos at a rate which is like 1.4. It's half or less than half of the average. So a lot of people lost their money. A lot of people had already lost their money, like 12 years before in the bank. So this was a very difficult time. Now, let me say why it's a good point to start that, because in many ways, I believe that the current situation, both the fact that Javier Milei won and, the challenges he has, we are still kind of dealing with things that happened then. And I'm going to give 3 reasons why. The first one is a lot of economic policies that really define the structure of the Argentine economy up till now were put in place there. There was this public emergency decree by Dualde, which then he was kind of an interim president. And 3 things stand out from there. First, the export taxes for agriculture, right? That's still very important for the public balance and for, the building up of reserves. Energy subsidies, of course, from 1 to 3 in the exchange rate, energy becomes so expensive, you had to do something. We did kind of a similar thing in France in 2022, where we capped the price of electricity and the government financed the rest. But we're coming out now. Energy subsidies were, they're still, not in the same amount, but they're still there, and they're really a big headache for Milei and for many other that came before, and also a social transfer program that they were put in place there, and then they were expanded over time. The social landscape changed completely. There was a lot of unemployment, but more people in unemployment, informality, and more people depending on social assistance, and that was really the key of a birth of a new political movement led by Nestor Kirchner, who by then we had no idea who he was. We only knew that he became famous because he took the money of his province out of the country before the crisis. That's everything that we knew about him. But the super fast recovery really consolidated him as a leader. And this was kind of a spin-off of Peronism. But he became, it really modified the political landscape in a way that is still going on today. Because, in the Milei's election, a lot of people really voted against Cristina Kirchner. Not all of them, but many of them. Now, I cannot come back on everything that happened until now, but I'm just showing, inflation, right? One thing that allows us a lot. So I have 2 graphs there for 2 reasons. One is because there are 2 different sources, because there was some issues with the inflation statistics in Argentina, as you might know, but also because of scale, because in the first graph, we reach like 70%, 50% inflation, right? That would be considered here a hyperinflation, right? If I show the second graph, it starts in 50, but it goes up to 300 almost, right? So you cannot put the same in. And this run-up of inflation, it was very much, I'm just doing a second, but influential in the election, and, it's shaping the package. So to me, the question is, so will Milei be a true revolutionary in the sense that will it make us a normal country? And this is really how people think about it. And if you think about normality and Milei, I know that sounds a bit weird, but this is how we see it. Or he will be another stage in this cycle of illusions and disillusions, as 2 economic historians in Argentina have put it. So yeah, that's it.
Thank you. Thank you, Juan. Greg, you mentioned in your book once and again these famous collective action clauses, right, to prevent holdouts from debt restructuring, how the lack of those in some debt contracts, did not benefit Argentina when we talk about this legal battle. Do you see that tool is enough? We are okay to protect sovereign countries with those clauses? We are seeing how some lawmakers are pushing to get some changes in the New York bill. So I want to start with a technical discussion before we enter full into Milei administration.
Yeah. The reality is, the conclusion of the book is that the market got so disgusted with the holdout litigation and the disruption of payments that they took an idea brought by US Treasury to make super powerful voting clauses in sovereign bonds, which means like when Greece restructured its English law bonds, it had 30 bonds, but holdouts blocked half of the bonds from reaching a 75% majority. So the US Treasury, when it went to the market to fix pari passu clauses, let's now make, if a country has 30 bonds, they all vote together, which makes it very, very hard to hold out. They're holdout killing clauses. Over 80% of sovereign bonds include them now, and as old bonds mature and they're refinanced. So the vast majority of sovereign bonds have a scheme. Argentina's deal in 2005 was 76% successful. So theoretically, if those all counted exactly right, there never would have been any litigation.
No book, Greg.
Yeah, well, the name of the book could actually be How the World Got Aggregated Collective Action Clauses but I thought it might sell more if it said the landmark court battle over Argentina's $100 billion debt restructuring. But it has a moral, and the reality is it took 100 years to write the United States' first bankruptcy law for corporations and individuals. We had our Constitution, something like 1790, finally enacted. It took until 1896. UPenn law professor David Skeel wrote a book called Debt's Dominion, going through all the fighting temporary laws that were taken away, too creditor-friendly, too debtor-friendly. It took a decade of negotiation in the 1890s to develop a balanced, fully working corporate bankruptcy scheme, which was further developed in the 30s and then in the 70s. So I see that Argentina was in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was the first very big restructuring of bonds. The 80s and 90s restructurings were of loans held by a very small number of people. And Argentina had hundreds of thousands of holders, and nobody knew how to do it. And so it was really the first try at a mess. And collective action clauses, powerful clauses, is like a third of bankruptcy. It's the voting part. It's not the stay of litigation part. It's not the DIP funding part, although the IMF kind of does that. So I think that there will be continued evolution and additions. Some may be appropriate for state law in New York and England. Some may be federal level, some may be international. The contracts themselves are imperfect in light of the disputes that broke out about how Argentina used the collective action clauses in 2020. So there should be continued evolution. But what I offer in my book is not the law or economics, but how the bargaining works in sovereign debt restructuring, so that as we continue to reform the system, it's with a good model of what it's like to be in the room. So I'm pro-reform. I'm in support of one of the three laws.
Which one?
Through Albany, the Champerty one. If only in my book, chapter 4 does the backstory of Elliott versus Peru, which ran from 1996 to 2000, which included the first use of the pari passu clause. But nobody knows this story really, that Peru used a Champerty defense accusing Elliott of buying its claims with the intent and purpose to sue, which is not allowed in New York State. And they got the federal district court to throw out Elliott's claim based on this defense, but the appeals court in 2000 overturned it, or in 1999. And meanwhile, there was lobbying, and they got New York State to remove the Champerty defense for claims over 500,000. And so now a senator is saying, well, why don't we take away that limitation and allow Champerty claims on bigger ones for sovereign debt? So there's kind of this historical piece of it, but the idea is, for the majority of creditors, is this disruptive litigation good for the market on balance or bad for the market? You have to be careful, because if debt is not enforceable in New York, you might as well write it all under Argentine law, which will be at a much higher yield. Anyway, that was the kind of long answer.
Thank you. Anahí, you mentioned in your presentation that it was kind of an illusion to think that the IMF was hands off when discussing Argentina back in 2001. And we see how, the US government was, reform first, money after reform, then money, reform, then money. Are you happy with the relationship that Argentina has with the IMF right now? Because we are, for now, talking about, refinancing again in the future, the 45 billion program.
That's a very tough question to answer. So for those of you who are not following Argentina on a daily basis, and things happen on a daily basis, so it's really hard to stay on top. Argentina is now trying to either refinance or actually ask for fresh money with the IMF. I'm not one to bet on Argentina, but I do think that it is in a way an uphill battle to get the IMF to have a greater exposure to the institution. So let's see where that story ends. I would like to, though, pick up on the PowerPoint, which Greg just made, and I think that is basically kind of the underlying kind of element throughout this book, but also in the relationships with the IMF. So I, at the end of the day, I completely agree, and this is one of the delights of the book, with the idea that in a way debt restructurings are in a way are kind of power games, and I think that that's how the relationship to the IMF also needs to be played to a certain extent, and this is also one of the reasons why collective action clauses, which I think, well, I'm personally an absolute firm defender of them. I think that they're extremely powerful, even, and this is an important point, even when they're not used. So even when collective action clauses are not used, they change the bargaining position. So the threat of using collective action clauses is already a change in the power dynamics. So I think that's a very important point. But essentially, because the debt restructuring is about power at the end of the day, collective action clauses, which are contract clauses, are never going to be enough in order to kind of resolve the underlying power asymmetries if you take the kind of standpoint from kind of the debtor's perspective. And here again is where in an imperfect world, or in a kind of in the second best world where we don't have analogous kind of domestic restructuring regime at the international level, you need in a way a kind of eclectic amalgam of things to kind of try to make up for that absence. And I think here, if we're talking about kind of New York legislation, but kind of legislation more generally, is where I think there's an English saying that is the power of the kind of pudding is in the eating. So basically the details matter, design choices matter. It matters kind of which of the legislative proposals kind of can potentially pass, but even more than that, kind of what design choices you make for each individual jurisdiction.
Thank you. I want to bring us a little bit to the present. Juan, you were mentioning that when you were reading the book, of course, you see that everything that happens during the 2000 crisis, we're still suffering some of those consequences, and the previous generations as well. And when I ask this simple question, I'm an Argentine as well. Why Milei got elected, right? Why do we have this new president that's so different from the other ones? And a common question that a common answer that I usually get is people were tired, right? They were tired. But my answer is, well, Argentines have been living in crisis for a long time with double-digit inflation. So what's different now, right? Why this time and not 4 years before that or 8 years before that? It's not just people are tired. Is there any other explanation that you find in this new government that we see in Argentina since, for a little bit, half a year, right? Half a year, yes.
Yes, yeah, of course, it's a question that is out there. No one saw it coming, actually, by the way. But I mean, it may say why I think that was the case. I mean, there are of course new things in Milei, right? I mean, he himself is very new to everyone, right? He's a persona which is very extravagant, very aggressive, and his communication styles. He's really, to me, like a man of his time. He manages communication, social media very well. This is why people thought that he wouldn't win, because he doesn't have any presence in the territories as we see. But he won in provinces where he was never there. So he manages communication and media very well. He's also part of kind of a global movement towards right-wing parties with this kind of confrontational style. But I think if you get with this sort of explanation, you wouldn't get to the roots. I think I think it's more an Argentine phenomenon than it's of course pushed by these global trends. But like if you see it from a recent historical perspective, we got back into democracy at the beginning of the 80s. Every new president really was elected because the economy was very bad, right? Always. Some people were elected because the economy was good. The new ones, they were elected on the mistakes of the other ones, basically, right? We have a huge hyperinflation end of the 80s. Then we have the 2001 crisis. Then you have a high growth, but then, sort of plateau until 2018, where you have another external crisis, and then and so on. So we know that, right? Now, but this came also with a lot of swings also in the politics. And really every time that the country has a crisis, it kind of reinvent itself in a way, right? So we had, a sort of market-friendly Peronist government in the 90s. Then you have another government that said, the state has to be present and want to regulate a lot of things and so on, right? Then we had the alternation of that was, center right government, like led by Berizzo Macri, so more traditional, if you want, liberal government. That that didn't end up well. So we are back to Peronist, like not the same the Kirchner is. Well, Cristina Kirchner was the #2 in Alberto Fernandez, right? And she was a big driver of that. And so you can think that, at least this is the way I see it, right? That we live in a sort of alternation between, sort of, as we call it, maybe it's not the way, like national popular bloc. We think that the state needs to run things and so on, and of a more of a liberal bloc. We think that market-friendly policies are what are taking out. And that is very clear in Greg's book, because when Macri comes in 2 seconds, the thing was done. So this is really alternation between people that have very different views. Now, I think that some people, like more traditional liberal mind people, say, okay, this guy is a bit crazy, but he might be the opportunity for us to change in the way. He had a bigger, clear mandate change, right? So, and some other people, of course, got that are much less ideological. They just want to have a kind of a dignified life, and especially the lower, people in the lower classes, that voted for him. So in that sense, to me, Milei is much less of a revolution that when people say. To me, it's like one more stage, as I put in there, of this ever-going cycle of pendular economics, of pendular politics, and so yeah, I think that's what probably. I think there are some news. I mean, one kind of funny thing, and then I end with that. We always seeking for a super economy minister, right? The Cavallo is the main that comes to mind. Always like a president, say, okay, this is going to be my super minister. In the case of Milei, he's an economist, so he's kind of blended the president and super minister in himself. He's talking all the time about economic. He's the one that, kind of giving directions. And that's, but again, I mean, if you look at people working with him, a lot of them, key people, were also in the government of Mauricio Macri. And if Milei wasn't around, the PRO, which is the center-left coalition, right-side coalition, would have made it. I mean, this is what we all thought. So it was a bit by accident and by being able to characterize, and also I think people really like politicians who are conflictual in Argentina, and everyone that is more moderated, if you think about Macri, if you think about De la Rúa, Alberto Fernandez, they didn't do well. People really like this kind of confrontation, and in that sense, also the Kirchners have kind of similar.
I saw you nodding when he mentioned pendular.
Thank you. So I actually will disagree with you. I think
we like that.
I think that Milei does bring something new to the table. So I also kind of think that, yes, we have, in a way, a more kind of liberal and a more kind of state interventionist, kind of more of a negative liberty versus kind of positive freedom sort of kind of camps in Argentina, absolutely. But Milei campaigned with a chainsaw. So to my mind, he's not just kind of, the new Washington consensus sort of president. He, in my mind, is a little bit more kind of the kind of death to the state president. So that is new. But I once was told by a kind of colleague of mine that nobody ever wins an election only with a negative campaign. So I think that we need to understand what Milei brings to the table positively. And I think it is true that Milei was voted for across the board, with the only, and this is, I think, interesting, with the only exception of female-led households. So kind of female led households voted more for Massa, the alternative. But other than that, he was voted for across the board. Having said that, I think that there is kind of a difference in what he kind of promised positively to different social classes. So to me, it's kind of either love or hope. So I think that in a way, we have a camp of Argentines, the kind of upper middle classes, the upper class, who pay for education, pay for healthcare, are in a way fed up with a state which they perceive to be a black hole, where they put things in and nothing really comes out. And then on the other hand, you have kind of the lower middle classes and the lower classes, who I think are kind of fed up with, in a way, being kind of second-class citizens, not having access to all of those things, not having access to the best education, not having access to kind of the best healthcare, everything you can kind of pay for with dollars in their hands, which is one of the things that Milei campaigned for, dollarizing the economy. And I think that in a way explains the story. So he promises love. So it's a love vote for the kind of upper and kind of upper middle and upper classes who he promises to kind of get rid of the state for. So death to the state means kind of, you know, like you will get rid of this extra thing that is just kind of a burden and not really offering anything. And for the lower classes and the low middle classes, it's a hope story. It's aspirational. You will be able to access all of the things that your kind of former Argentines get because they have kind of money in their pockets. So now the question obviously is if he can live up to that or not.
We're going to get it in a few minutes to your questions, so please be ready because I want you to be participating in this panel. I hope you have a lot of questions of the current administration and of the past. But Greg, you had the opportunity to actually interview a lot of the members of the Milei team, right? We have Luis Caputo, who is the economy minister right now. He used to be part of the Macri team. We have Santiago Bausili. He's the central bank chief right now. He used to be part of the finance secretary back then. When you see this new composition / old composition of the economic team and the central bank team, do you think he could be successful with his what Milei calls his stabilization plan, right?
Well, it's interesting because in the book, this is the deal that could never get done. I'd worked with Jamaica, and the public part of resolving its debt swap with its IMF program was a couple of months. And sure, Zambia is taking 3.5 years, but most countries take a year or two. This is the one that took 15 years to clean up. So it's like, why? What were the mistakes that were made? What were the human mistakes during the negotiating period at the IMF in Argentina among creditors at the IMF board? And what were the hardware problems, the lack of CACs, the lack of STRM, which led to all this litigation? And what mistakes did the judge make? So yet at the end, in the last chapter, out of the blue, Macri sends 2 inexperienced public officials. They'd come from Wall Street banks, and as far as I know, haven't been in government at all. Luis Caputo is the finance secretary, and Santiago Bausili, his subordinate, the undersecretary, and basically says, go to New York and don't come back until you fix the litigation problem. And they'd been bond issuance and trading people, so they understood the math in the law of what was going on, and they were good negotiators. But it is unbelievable. Within 4 weeks, they completely turned the table on the biggest hedge funds. They got the court on their side. They got investors settling at a huge discount. And nobody who'd been following this could believe what they achieved. They saved probably over $1 billion by being smart, by being fair. And it's an amazing concluding chapter to a 15-year process where you're like, well, why weren't people more reasonable in 2003? None of this had to happen. So after all the mess, it makes it even more interesting. And Luis Caputo said, well, why should I tell you my story? I'm going to write it myself. He's a little tough
A
negotiator.
lot of people told you that
Yeah.
while doing your book, right? They were going to write their own book.
But I got good at that. I said, you know, Luis, you can't appreciate the greatness of your success without the 14 years that came before it, and you're not going to do that. So it is true. And so you also saw in July 2014, I don't want to be critical, but when the injunction first got imposed, Elliott really wanted to settle and offered a pretty good discount, even slightly better than Caputo and Bausili got. But the then minister and team couldn't close the deal. And whether they technically couldn't do it or the president Kirchner just was never going to do it, it's not entirely clear. But you would have had to do a lot of sophisticated, subtle things. I'll be very nerdy, but you had a clause in the bond that didn't expire for 6 months, that if they paid more to the holdouts, the 8%, they had to pay the extra amount to all 92%, which would financially collapse the country. And what I know, and which Santiago knows, because we both used to do this on Wall Street, is you can run a kind of vote and remove that clause, and then you can go and do the deal. And it's like, he could have done that in a week, but it's not the sort of thing that ministry team knew of, and it's not even clear the president wanted to settle. So when you see the Caputo Basili Wall Street trained team come in and turn the table on the biggest hedge fund, you know they're using their 20, 30 years of banking experience to outsmart a banker. So I know they worked hard. I know they're very technically proficient, and I'm as aware as anybody of and they're more aware than I am of the errors of the Macri administration, digging the country into a deeper hole. And so from what I understand, they are great technical people, but they're taking direction from the top. And so, but there's a difference, is I'm not making a comment on the plan. That is a social contract. How deep do you make the cuts? How fair do you get the cuts? Which part of society are bearing the brunt of the cuts? If you do 1,000 pages of regulation with Mr. Sturzenegger, I have not read those. These are all important things which people on the ground need to comment on. All I know is this is a very technically skilled team, but have not had the investment to understand the details of it. And I think there is, from an outsider, it's clear that it's an authoritarian process. There is a ruling by decree, not through Congress, a sequestering of funds that are supposed to go to people as part of a bargaining power. And this is a very difficult thing to watch. Now, the previous governments did rule by decree, so it's nothing new, but this seems as an outsider to be a very unstable political situation. Maybe Milei is maintaining popularity, but people seem to say, well, maybe he'll be, because he has no majority in the Senate or in the deputies, can he be popular and get enough success through the midterm election to rule properly? And I think this is an unprecedented situation that I don't know what the questions other people have. I don't understand what's going to happen in the next month, the next 3 months, the next 6 months. Is this politically sustainable? And is inflation coming down? He's really stopping spending. I know from my knowledge of even Argentina's 2003, 2004, 05 stabilization program, being fiscally tight does fix some other things, but at what cost? So anyway.
Anahí, Juan, do you want to follow up on that question on the stabilization plan? Do you think that, Juan, that this big, bill that Milei has sent to Congress, we still didn't see the vote in the Senate? That still, those waters needs to be tasted still. Is that enough to show that his plan is working?
I mean, yeah, I have some things to say about what you say, but we can say later on. That's okay. I mean, again, I think there are kind of two stages in the way he's approaching. I mean, so what is success here, right? That's, what is success? Well, economists in general, we don't know what is the success. We have debates of that, but I think there's one, like, sort of, at least the way they are approaching it, a sort of first stage, which is really aimed at attacking inflation, and is based on two things. One is the balance in the budget, right? Zero deficit, and that was really super fast, right? Like in the first quarter, we got to this, he called it the sharpest adjustment in human history, but that is a complete exaggeration, right? And of course, the grounds of that is still very much debate, because a lot of that was not updated by inflation, and many other things. So that's like the first pillar he's doing. And the second pillar is try to recompose or to improve the ratio of the quantity of pesos to dollars. So this is really the two things that are going together. And it's very good that you talk about Caputo and Basili, who know themselves very well, because it's not a detail that one is the Minister of Economy. So, to me, the Mr. Economy, is Milei, but, Caputo is some sort of secretary of, treasury or something like that. And he has someone that he understands very well, and, they work very well together in the central bank. So that means that coordination between the treasury and the central bank is very important, because they try to reduce the quantity of pesos, basically, but making, like banks mostly lend to the treasury and not to the central bank. If you remember the early Macri years, Federico Sturzenegger was the head of the central bank, and Alfonso Prat was the minister of economy. And that's like a more traditional sort of framework in which there was a lot of fighting between the central bank and the head of treasury, because this is what textbook models are. Right. And therefore, this program has things which are non-standard. For example, in any sort of stabilization program, you would have a real interest rate which is very high, because that's how you reduce demand and reduce prices. Here, the interest rate in Argentina today is negative, and this negative interest rate is exactly so that people stop lending to the central bank and they start lending to the treasury. And of course, what they don't want is that this money goes to dollars, right? Because if they go to dollar, you will have a devaluation, and that will be a second round on inflation and so on. And therefore, this explains why the currency controls are still in place, right? But it's a very fine tuning between the ministry, the treasury, and the central bank into how to reduce the central bank. And the trust on that is, you can look at the FX gap as a trust of that. When at the beginning it was short, now it's kind of widening because people don't think that's sustainable. So now the recession, of course, is helping to reduce inflation. That's kind of standard economics. But at the same time, maintaining the balance means that's why I mentioned the energy subsidies at the beginning. Right? I mean, you need to lift those, and that's a lot of inflationary pressure. So this plan is kind of weird in the sense you regulate, and you have a lot, pressures via inflation, which are mechanical, taking out the, I'm just increasing the price of electricity, but that rise inflation. At the same time, you lower wages, you lower pensions, right? So that's this inflation, right? And also the recession is very important to maintain the external surplus. So the issue is that when the economy starts to recover, and we can talk about how it will recover or whether, that will make life more complicated. That's the big trick now, right? And then I think this reform is more for the second stage, sort of kind of supply side economics, but we are very far away from that right now.
I'll try to be brief. I'll say two things. One thing which follows neatly from what Juan just mentioned, which is, do we still have the same fiscal adjustment that Milei says is the biggest fiscal adjustment in the world, in the history of the world? Well, I don't know. I don't think so. I don't think that today it's the same than in January. And I think that there is a temporal element to this fiscal adjustment. And some of the measures he did implement are not, you cannot maintain them in time. So for instance, just to give one example, not paying importers. That's not something he can do kind of forever. And that's already coming to an end. So we'll see what comes next. And then I think the more interesting question is at what cost and what Argentina does this kind of sort of plan leave us? And I think those two things are related. So more than 1/3 of the fiscal adjustment was kind of shouldered by pensioners. I think this gives the first indication of the Argentina that it leaves us. I think a more unequal Argentina is the answer. And then secondly, one thing he did, which I think is also not sustainable in time, for instance, is kind of just shutting down public infrastructure, kind of. Well, like the Development Bank, the BID, had committed a kind of a loan to build, I don't remember what, to be honest, but like that needs to be used. That cannot not be used. So eventually that will also come to an end. Like he will have to increase it. But what's the Argentina it leaves us behind with? Well, one that is less kind of complex. So one that has a less complex insertion into the world economy. And I think that's something that is kind of not something to be celebrated. I think that in the world in which we live, where climate change is a reality, where we want to kind of both develop and adapt to a kind of world that will be facing the kind of biggest challenge in its history, we need a more complex economy. So I think that the Argentina, it leaves us behind, is in a way a mirror of kind of the fiscal adjustment we've seen so far. And I think that it's not something to be celebrated.
Thank you. Let's going to open the floor for questions. Who is going to be the first brave one to kick off? Andres, yes?
Hi. No, I have a question for Greg. You were speaking about like an evolution of debt contracts, and then you were at the same time advocating for a hands-on approach from like a third party in the restructuring negotiation. And I have the feeling that in this evolution of contracts, one dominant force is that when you have these restructurings, you have a conflict between taxpayers on one hand that are represented by a government and lenders that have some property. And then when you have the hands-on approach by somebody else, it's very hard for the third party to be legitimate because they are going to impose something on taxpayers, but they are not representing the taxpayers, and they're imposing somebody on the creditors. And the evolution seems to be going on the way of the representative of the taxpayers makes offers, and a collective of the creditors aggregating their power makes an up or down. So in some way, the evolution is towards has a lot of legitimacy because you have the representative of the taxpayer bargaining with a very clear protocol with the owners of the property, right? So my question is, how do you view in this evolution the role of an quote unquote illegitimate third party? It could be a court that enforces a contract that the two wrote and decided that will resolve and interpret the contract. But what do you have in mind for the hands-on?
Good. We want to do one question at a time, right? Okay, thank you. That gets back to the triangle diagram that I gave. We're eventually dealing with what I think is the hardest question in the world, and you asked it directly. People, if there's a flaw in SDRM, sovereign debt court modeled on corporate bankruptcy, is that it's a different problem with the corporation because you have an order of priority between the secured creditors, the preferred creditors, the shareholders, and the process is to maximize recovery value, period. And here what you've described is the heart of the problem of sovereign debt restructuring. You have, how do you balance the recovery of a creditor who lent money, who may have been representing pensioners in Italy and other countries, that's their savings, against a country who has to pay, if you pay more to the creditors, you have less health, education, welfare, public safety. That is an impossible problem. There's no fair way to do it, but you have to find a process to do it. Because if you say, wipe out all the debt, then there's no market. And developing countries can't develop. They need cheap debt capital from outside the world. But if you go to the other extreme, creditors lent money, they have to dictate the outcomes, then there's never a haircut in countries have serial restructurings. And so what we've come to, that we're not beginners at this. We've been doing sovereign debt restructurings for decades. The Paris Club has been doing it since 1956. It's been proven that you need to have a consensual, informal process with all the relevant parties at the table. And the Argentina case study in my book is what happens if you take the IMF out of the room. Because what the US Treasury did an experiment on that deal. The US Treasury under the Bush administration said, we have a new theory. We don't want the US government to interfere anymore. We interfered in the 80s and 90s. We had Baker plans and Brady plans, and we were very involved with the Asia crisis, and we got a lot of criticism. We don't want to do it. So let's just let the country fight it out with their creditors. And boy, what a fight it was. They were $50 billion apart, $100 billion worth of debt. Argentina wanted to issue $25 billion of bonds to settle it. The creditor committee wanted $75 billion, and the IMF under US Treasury direction sat on his hand. And when I interviewed the people who were at Treasury, I said, why in the world? This went on for 6 months. Why in the world didn't you get in the middle and force a settlement in the beginning? And they said, oh, we weren't allowed to. The bosses told us not to. We were doing it different this time. A very wise man who was very senior at the IMF summed it up to me saying, Argentina gave its body to science. So call it illegitimate, complain about the IMF. Oh, they're meanies. They come in and they give me conditions, as the third world global south says all the time. You need them. They are a member organization. They have great teams of people who model, visit, get all the numbers, do comparative analysis to other countries in good faith work to help to come to a reasonable solution. There is nobody possibly compared. The judge knows nothing. So when you're in court, you're in a bad place because it tends to be creditor friendly. So I would say the experiment of kicking the IMF out of the room was horrible. You need them in the room. Now, to what Anahí has said here and other places, countries have to fight for themselves. They have to learn how to bargain with the IMF hard. They have to have their own DSAs. They have to, and as we heard on the earlier panel, like Natalie Jaresko said, countries have to wait, slow down. If we're going to implement raising the gas prices, let's slow it down by 2 months so we can have a plan to cushion the impact on the poorest households. Those are things you can negotiate with the IMF if you're really ready for it. But if all the political people are like, oh, we don't want the IMF to come, we don't want the IMF, delay year after year, and then the IMF comes at the last minute and nobody's prepared. So anyway, so as much as you suggest they're illegitimate third party, I said they're an essential illegitimate third party. You need them.
So you suggest them in a role as a mediator? No, because there is a contract evolution that solves some of the problems, but that's part of the evolution that the other collective action clauses seem to fix some of the problems with Argentina. But in some way, you're saying that the hands-on approach might be the IMF working as a very savvy mediator, trying to bring the parties together, which is very different from imposing a solution to the parties.
Yeah, the contracts only help you get hundreds of thousands of dispersed bondholders all into one deal. So they help you mechanically close a deal. What I'm talking about, what we're really talking about is the smaller number of people who are around the table when the deal is really cut. And as you just articulated, how do you refine the role of the IMF so they're fair to the country, but you know, that's the art of it. And I hope my book helps because a lot of people made a lot of mistakes and they have to be economists, but they have to be diplomats and they have to be market smart and they can't get tricked by funny GDP warrants that blow up in the face of the country.
I think Anahí wants to comment on that, and then we have a question over there first, and then here, and then we'll go back to you.
I'll try to be quick. I just wanted to say that this is a very relevant discussion also for ongoing restructuring cases and not only middle-income countries, right? I think that in the common framework, we've seen also kind of that the IMF is taking, in a way, a blessed informal referee role. I mean, it's blessed in the sense that it is essentially part of the common framework. The kind of common framework requires kind of upper credit tranche IMF program, and then the IMF is involved in every single step of the way in a way. So like you need kind of, you have the financing assurance policy. So all of this is kind of the IMF essentially kind of mediating not only the relationship with the restructurings with bilateral official creditors, but because the common framework also expects comparability of treatment with private creditors, also with private creditors. I think that's the world we live in. And I think that's the world Argentina lived in back then as well. So that's what I was trying to push back on. The idea that the hands-off approach ever existed. It didn't exist, and it will not exist in any time in the near future. So given that that's the case, I think we need to ask ourselves the question, how do we deal with an IMF as a kind of from the country perspective? And I think we need to push for policy. So we need to push for better IMF policy, but that has its limitations. And I think Argentina's history tells us why, because basically, like you have a certain policy, but if kind of executive directors don't like the policy, they'll give you another policy or they'll stretch the policy. So I think that we need to A, get a better policy, and B, understand the politics of the institution. And, in the second best world, try to navigate that to the best of our abilities.
We have a question over there.
Yes, thank you. Simple questions. 3 dates. When do you think Argentina will restructure or reschedule its debts again? When do you think Argentina will go to the market again? And when do you think IMF exposure to Argentina will be lower than 10 billion? Thank you.
Is that the question for all of them?
Yes.
Okay, we are going to be busy, and then we can bring the mic over here for the third question. Juan, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, write it down. I'm going to give you the exact dates and times. No, I mean, I think the situation where Argentina is living right now is very, very uncertain, right? As I said before, to me, the way I see this, we are at the first part of a plan which, is trying to deal with like short-term issues, inflation, right? And there was this huge package of the regulation that is there that is, still being negotiated. I mean, I don't think that, just coming back 1 second, in the 90s, we really had a change. So because we privatized many other things, a lot of things. So that was demolition of it. So now this is still grounded on sort of, Pierre de Barro, so that's one key issue, right? So until Milei, and they're like one very important, so next year there are midterm elections, right? So Milei has to really go through this year in a way that he still can have support from as he still have, has like 55 positive image, right? So that implies that inflation goes a little bit down, not to European inflation rates. We want to have very high inflation by these standards, and you saw some recovery with income losses. If we make it there, then we can think of building a real governance program, right? And then we will be able to know if Milei will exactly lead us to a path where debts are paid and so on, right? As Anahí was saying, a lot of the fiscal deficit here, it seems not to be that sustainable because it's slashing salaries, slashing, so what is the real growth program here? That's a very important question, and this is the question that underlies yours, right? Because we're gonna be doing well if we start growing in a sort of way, which is in growth, which is as economists like to, which is productivity-based growth with technology transfer and so on. And for that, we need a lot of capital inflows, not for the debt, for for the productive sector. And that will only happen when things get really stable on the political side. And even then, we are still Argentina. We are not, we're not gonna be Sweden tomorrow. So that is big challenge for them. So I think these dates, well, hopefully they will, the good ones, right, coming to the markets and so on. I mean, if he delivers the zero deficit, we're not going to the market, I guess, I don't know, but exactly. I mean, the question is a question which is, people are now asking themselves, and we don't know yet. No one knows, I think, we hope it will.
Well, it's a very political question. If you ask the administration, they'll say never again. That is their intention. They do not want to default again. Contracts should be honored. That is why they're running the 5% surpluses. They want to bring in money to the central bank, positive cash flow, reopen the market so they can refinance maturing debt, rebuild confidence so capital comes in. This is huge returns if the country normalizes. Lots of job growth, a lot of good things could happen, but the question is, can you get there? Can you suffer the social pain? Are you politically stable to getting to where it will work? And that's the question mark. So the jury is out, and that's what people, the market bond prices are betting on. Is this going to happen or not? I hope for the people in Argentina, the misery ends. This has gone on for too long. The crisis after crisis just makes poor people poor. And so no prediction there. I just want the history of repeat crisis to end. How you get there is a dispute, but to be in a stable financial situation, to not be going back like happened in the 2010s, constantly overspending, getting back into inflation, getting back into default, that's good for nobody. But the hard thing is normalizing.
We have another question over here.
Thanks. Congratulations on the book, Greg. It's a great read, indeed a page turner. I had two questions, one technical for you, and then maybe a broader one for the team. The technical is, who is Elliot in the sense of who actually funded this for 15 years? I imagine it has to be in some sort of closed-end vehicle where you can pass on the lawyer's fee to someone else. Curious there. And then the second, I think the reason it's a nice book is that it sort of captures the power dynamics nicely, and maybe the economics people can comment on how is it that Argentina lost the ability to export in dollars, which very much goes alongside the primary surpluses and deficits.
Yes, I think then we will have time for one more question. Anybody else at the back? Two more questions and we have to wrap it up at the back, and then we'll go back to you, and then we have to wrap it up. We'll make it fit. Greg?
Elliot, they're just some guys. They invest, they're very clever legally. Paul Signer ran the fund. You know, they're press shy, but the lucky thing I came upon, because they certainly wouldn't talk to me. The firm kindly did some fact checking with me at that, which I really appreciated, but there's no open interview. And when they had this Champerty suit with Peru, Peru used a Champerty defense. So Judge Sweet let Peru's lawyers do discovery and put them on the stand for 5 days. There's an 800-page transcript where everybody on the Elliott team has to give testimony. So there's this beautiful record of who these people are, in the sense they're asked, who are you? When did you start your firm? What is your investment strategy? Why did you buy this bond? What were you intending to do? So I actually provide the most detailed understanding of who these people are and how they went about making money. Whether it was the CEO of the firm's own money, he had started the firm himself in 1977 and got very rich in it. It could have just been his money. They could have had client money. It's now a $35+ billion fund. In a sense, it doesn't matter. They personally, as a firm, were willing to aggressively sue sovereigns. Prior to that, a lot of firms set up ABC, XYZ companies in the Caymans and hid who they were, but they were willing to do it themselves and take the heat for it and say, we think that makes the world a better place. You honor contracts and you can borrow money cheaper and you will be better in the long run. And they say that on the stand. And it's really quite notable. And you have in the contrast, Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, these are vultures and they're preying off the blood of our people. So it's real drama and food for thought. How are we gonna resolve debt situations with partisans on both sides pushing to the extremes.
Anahí, do you want to follow up with
Yeah, I mean, so about the export, so, well, very quick maybe, but we lost the ability to do a lot of things, right? But, if you look at the exports of Argentina since the crisis, I mean, but then there was, export depend on two things. I'm come more from the trade literature. So how I see export, you have external factors, and at the beginning of the 2000s, we have these super cycle commodities, and then, the landscape of, around more than half of our exports were related to these sort of primary products. And if you went to Argentina at that time, there was a lot of discussion because, soybeans and all these things, they were replacing more cattle and things like that. So that depends a lot to external factors. The rest of the exports, well, there are many explanations. We were never really a power horse of industrial products or things like that for many reasons. The quality is not enough. There's a lot of difficulties to import. For example, Argentina between 2005 and 2015 lost 3,000 or 4,000 exporters. So people, firms that really stopped exporting. That's very, very clear. So I mean, again, it's a country. I mean, and most of our problems is that we depend too much on, a large share of our exports depend on a handful of cultures, that depend on global conditions, right? And also of climate conditions in Argentina. Every time you have a dryness, this, like Macri had the dryness, this is fault of the climate, and Alberto Fernandez had the same, we always complaining because, it goes with development, like, I don't know, now people are talking about the Korean miracle and so on. We can talk about that, but none of these things are in place in Argentina. If you want, that would be like my short answer.
Thank you. We have two more questions, but then we have to first do a quick break because we have a technical issue. So please bear with me here. Promise. I think we are ready for your question back there. Yes, thank you so much.
So I want to congratulate Greg for writing a book on legal technicalities like pari passu clauses and caps. That's a real page turner, which is no mean feat. But what's so striking about the book is how little role law actually plays in the whole debt renegotiation exercise. I mean, it talks a lot about the contracts, but there's no discussion about all the other legal obligations that the parties have. I mean, the Argentinian state has a whole lot of international legal obligations under all the treaties that it signed. It has constitutional obligations, which are all legally at least as valid as the contractual claims. The IMF is a creature of international law. It has responsibilities and obligations which never get mentioned by anybody. The home state that governs the creditors has obligations, including extraterritorial human rights obligations. The creditors themselves have responsibilities that should be taken into account. And none of that seems to enter into the discussions. So my question for Greg is, did they enter in any way into these discussions or in your interviews of the parties?
That's a good question. And having lived through deals like this, which is why I could write about it the way I did, and I had to pick a deal I didn't work on because you can't spill the secrets of things you were trusted with. So I interviewed people understanding all that context. In a few places, I could refer to those other obligations, but when you're a minister, you have teams of people telling you what you can and can't do. And it is very slow and is very hard. Then you have your attorney general, you have your quantitative people, you have your president, you have your central bank, and bondholders generally have the authority to make decisions in their portfolio. And they get very frustrated in dealing with sovereigns because they're like, why is it taking a day to get a turnaround on the term sheet every time we agree to something? So I was doing something for Kazakhstan in London, and you have the committee, and then it had to go back to Almaty or wherever. And they're like, why are these guys so slow? But when you work with the government, they're going through all of these things. And only in one part in the book can I talk about it because Judge Grisset is frustrated. He wants it over. It's July 22nd, 2014. There's 16 days until Argentina defaults on everybody because the injunction is coming on in place, and he's asking everybody to just cut a deal to avoid the default. And he says, stay up all night. And Jonathan Blackman, Argentina's lawyer, who I quote at length for exactly this reason, he said, Judge, this is not a labor management negotiation like in the 60s where you stay up all night. You have a president, they run a country, they have a constitution, they have constituencies. The person here in New York has to go through a lot of processes. They can't stay up all night. And Miss Judge Grisey, this isn't going to work out very well. You can't move that fast if you're a government. So please just extend the stay of the injunction to January 15th, so we have time to deal with it, and we have time for a negotiation, and we have time to go through the political process. He says, no, I want it done right now. And the government was beginning to get close to a deal in the last 2 days, but with limited amount of time, the government couldn't solve all the problems or wasn't comfortable with it, and splat. And one of my alternative realities is, what if Judge Grisey was more patient and gave another 6 months, but after 14 years, you wouldn't have been patient. So it's just a little taste of it, but I'm hoping even so, the bondholders who read it get to understand a little more complicated the tremendous pressures the ministers are under when they negotiate with them, the political pressures, the multiple layers of legal pressures.
Just 1 second, really. It's nice that you quote that, because it really struck me in the book how, you put this up to kind of not really understanding the nature of the exercise about 14, the fact that these are ministers, they kind of moved to New York. You mentioned that was also, you talk a lot about the lack of a legal framework, and again, that kind of shows it was a very graphical way on that. And I was kind of scary when you do that, because,
We have one question over there, and the back. Do you want to do the question? Okay.
Yeah. This is working?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I have the impression we had sort of two propositions in the discussion. One is on the debt lessons and debt negotiation lessons from Argentina up to 2016. That is, I heard the book, and I have it ignited a tremendous interest to read it. You're gonna lend me one until I get Amazon to send it to me. And then there is this Milei jump into the curiosity here, because we don't have much time. I will go into the first side. In terms of the lessons, not much has changed in what we know about sovereign debt and the absence of a respected international jury in case of conflict, the absence of collateral respect to a private credit market, the absence of credible penalties in case of default of repudiation or a negative to comply with the contracts. So there is always the implicit contract of the exchange of reputation to stay in the market, and the implicit contract on the creditor side to make business. So I think we are searching for solutions that will not be there only marginally. One is the progress in the details, as you say. For instance, to reduce the incentive for opportunistic players to get hostage of the process, the famous vultures. So the changes we have seen are a progress in this sense, because they change the majorities and they reduce the space for the, but I don't think we are gonna see a perfectly respected arbitrator. To put the IMF in that role will be a strange thing, because he is part of the game. He is a creditor. So he can be an assistant, but in a lot of these negotiations, there are credits of the IMF, and the IMF could side, if it wants to arbitrate, it could bias the process to privilege and to be strategic. So it's not a good road. And last but not least, all this discussion about the IMF, we know that it's better to have more markets than less markets, and more complete markets than more incomplete markets. we have one more player. We can use it or we cannot use it. We can participate in this market. We can avoid this market. But this market is a plus. And finally, the IMF is a political process. Sure, because it's money of other countries. It's a multilateral organization, it's not a private actor. And so there shouldn't be any surprise that there is a political interjection, because the representative of the countries, the voter in the board, is representing a country, not even his property rights. He's just a delegate. So my question is, aren't we searching for some magic there that will never come?
Anahí, you want to take that?
I'm happy to. So I think that I disagree with kind of one main thing, which is nothing has changed. I actually think a lot has changed. And in a way, it makes your kind of assessment of the situation even more worrisome. Because if we take a kind of broader look, not only at Argentina, but emerging markets and developing economies more generally, what we see since 2008 is that the landscape has changed, and it has made it more complex if a restructuring is needed. So, for instance, the composition of creditors changed. We have more creditors in the game. So the aligning of the different interests and the kind of tying of the kind of package, especially for countries now undergoing, for instance, the common framework process, has become much more difficult. So yes, we do not live in a kind of in a ideal world. There is no magic bullet, and it is becoming more complex. So I think that my kind of realistic assessment of we live in the world we live in, and we need to deal with the IMF to the best of our abilities, etc., is just a kind of a recognition of the fact that although I do not necessarily agree with the description, I do agree with the conclusion, which is we need to kind of do improvements at the margins, even if it might feel like fiddling while Rome burns. And the last thing on the IMF and the market, again, dissatisfying answer, but the problem with this is as well is that they're not independent of each other. So I have often heard from market participants that if a particular country has a large exposure to the IMF, they will not want to go in. So that is a real risk as well. So I think we need to think about this as kind of, in a way, a package. It's a kind of, we need to see the whole picture in order to be able to know what to do with the IMF and the market.
Thank you. Last question.
Yes, Diego Rivetti from the World Bank. Great panel, great book. I'm trying to connect a bit the Argentinian case with the ongoing discussion about the New York clauses. And I understand, Greg, that you're in favor of temporary. I'm just wondering, how can temporary be enforced? In the end, no hedge fund would call itself a bolter, and there are also, legitimate hedge funded by, in the secondary market that create the market actually for this kind of asset, and then decide not to participate to the restructuring for legitimate reason. So, how can differentiate those that buy in order to sue and those that have just a preference in that sense? Are we going to do hearings? No, I heard before that in the case of Elliott, there have been weeks of hearings, but clearly that's something that cannot be done, across the board. And related to that, don't you think that Chapter 2030 could have been beneficial for Argentina to kind of have a better position towards holdouts, to limit the power of holdouts? The Chapter 2030 that in a way cap the amount of recovery and link it to the US Treasury, for instance.
Yeah, to be short and related to the book, there were 3 draft laws in New York. I guess there still are. 2 were married together. 2 of the 3, including the 230 you referred to, were either highly problematic or badly drafted and not ready to be voted on. Lots of problems. The 3rd one is clean, a rifle shot. It's already in the law. It's a question of who it applies to. And to your particular question, you write the language to say if you're a regular investor, a conventional investor who buys and holds new securities, or even you're a hedge fund who buys at a discount, but you regularly participate on creditor committees, this champerty thing doesn't apply to you. It's really designed for the serial litigators who are not normal market people. And what it does is it exposes them to discovery. And what happened in chapter 4 of the book is Elliot had a year of discovery. Sure, they were on the stand for a week, but that was preceded by month after month of deposition. And so it's actually quite a severe penalty. And that, because if you lose a champerty claim, then your claim may actually become worthless. So it's actually quite a disincentive for anybody to purposefully buy debt to hold out of a transaction to sue. And so it's something designed that you buy the bonds because you want to get repaid, and you're going to be kind of reasonable if there's a restructuring, and you're not going to just buy to litigate. As long as we don't have a sovereign debt court and a sovereign debt restructuring, it's a free game. So it's something to add on to CACs, another layer of protection for bonds that don't have CACs and things like that.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for participating with your questions. Thank you, Greg, Anahí, and Juan. Thank you for discussing Argentina. Hopefully, more books will come from all this panel on Argentina, which is always an interest topic. We have a little break right now. 5:30 is the last panel of the day, and we have 2 more days of discussion. So thank you so much again for the invitation, and thank you for coming to here to us today.